Yes, Mr. John Williams. How are you?
Mr. Arthur, you almost answered the question I had for you in your last few parts of your address, which is how do we get it done? Because although you did not mention the term public sector reform, when you talked about business facilitation, that is the key to getting the growth and the development. And of course, the beauty of it is that it does not mean further deficits or additional borrowing in general. You talked about setting up a unit in the Prime Minister's office. That worried me somewhat because our experience in something the size of Barbados, and you may want to look to Ireland trying to get out of its current problems, is that they've actually given that responsibility not to a unit, but to a senior minister. And my question to you is, in your thinking, as I'm sure that you are doing now, were you in that position to form a cabinet after the election? How would you give the assurance to the business community who welcomes the comments today, but real question is, will it get done?
I didn't want to call it private sector reform because that term, quite frankly, I think has assumed a certain vacuousness about it. But business facilitation and private sector reform may be part of the same process. But very often private sector reform is lost in the velleities about people terms and whatever. Business facilitation is what we are about. We have known private sector reform. In speaking to the matter, I'll come to your question. There has to be a change in our culture to accept it too. This country has been a good place to live because we've been very paternalistic, both in the public sector and in the private sector. In the public, we like to get along. And Barbadians, whether in the public or the private sector, and especially in the private sector, you give a fella a blind. We like to rather follow rules, and people sit in the same place in church on Sundays, and so on. That is the Barbadian society. And therefore, radical change in the way how you do things has not always been easy to accept. Across the Barbados society, we get along. And there has not been an edge to our capitalism. You feel in the private sector that to put a man out who has been inefficient is to hurt somebody that you know. And it's the same thing in the public sector. So that in a small society, you have those cultural influences that have stopped both the public sector and the private sector from radically making serious changes to make efficiency, innovation, and a hard-nosed approach to doing things part of the Barbadian way of doing business. But you're absolutely correct. It doesn't cost anything to do it. And it has to be done because it is the biggest constraint on doing business in this country. And I say the wake-up call is when we lose 2,700 jobs and $1 billion in new investment in the international business sector, not because we don't have a good brand, but because you just can't get things done fast enough, then I believe that we can all agree that we can no longer afford the lethargy. Now, where the Prime Minister's office? Well, the Prime Minister's office that I knew was a place where, quite frankly, existed to make things happen. And I had a very unappealing attitude that if things didn't happen, I will fire people. And there's still in Barbados a confidence in the awesome power of the Prime Minister's office as the place where when something must be done, it has to be done. I remember in 1998 when we faced the challenge from the OECD. I said, look, I'm going to clear my desk of everything else. This is a challenge to the very survival of the Barbados economy. It requires the attention of the leader of the country. And it had to be done. This is something that has to be done. And believe me, we've seen, and I'm not here trying to be political, but we've seen where certain line ministers have been challenged by other line ministers. So to put this in a like ministry where some minister may say that I'm telling officials not to go to that. No. I will humbug you. I really would. So this has to carry, if it is as important as we say it is. It's not just a public sector. I'm not using that term anymore. Business facilitation is a function as important as investment. And it has to be, not, the Prime Minister's office is not going to do work with the Immigration Department, but if there are benchmarks that have to be met, then you report every month, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Applications should not last more than X. How many have you done? And how many have kept within the benchmarks? So the Prime Minister's office do what a Prime Minister's office is to do. It coordinates the work of the government. And having it in the Prime Minister's office, I think, would invest it right now with the towering importance that it requires. Then you have an international report that is telling us that our competitiveness is because of bureaucracy. We got to deal with it. And you can deal with it once there's the requisite leadership. So do not misunderstand what I'm saying. The Prime Minister's office should not do the day-to-day work. But it must make sure that those that have to do the work on a ministry basis do the work. And it may also say that if they don't do the work, then you should feel the weight of a Prime Minister who should move heaven and earth. And you've heard that term. Where things are important, you move heaven and earth. And if they're not being done, you move heaven and earth to make sure that they're doing. But we move that stage. And the economy is spiraling downwards. And if the message has to go forward to Barbados, there can be no more half measures. We have lived with this too long. And it may also say that all of us have lived in an indulgent, paternalistic society where we have just said, let's get along with everybody else. And yes, that has worked for us, but it can't carry us any further. So I hope nobody feels threatened by this. But when everything is on the line, everything is on the line. Thank you for the question, John. Yes, sir.
Hi, Mr. Arthur.
I hear Lalu first, and then I hear you.
Go ahead, Ed.
Mr. Arthur, in keeping in what you've been discussing, I'm concerned that you said that because of our high cost here in Barbados, the way to keep our tourism going is we recognize that we should be a five-star destination. But being a five-star destination means that we need to attract branded hotels, branded entertainment, branded food. We need to reinvent ourselves that we really start to deliver what we say that we are. Can I assume that if you are elected under your administration, that everything is on the table, including casino gambling? Is that perhaps something that we're going to look at?
I don't know the precise sense in which that makes you a five-star destination. Because if I may answer your question, sir, if you ask it, there are other destinations in the Caribbean that are top quality destinations that don't have casino gambling. So I don't know the direct one-on-one relationship between being a five-star destination and between casino gambling. But if you want to argue that there should be casino gambling in Barbados as part of tourism, you can argue that. May I urge you to sit down with your colleague and see if you can build a consensus for it. Because there's things that, and let me be very candid with you, the things that I felt that I was able to accomplish as a leader of this country were things for which you build a consensus. The nationals, in my view, when I look back on 14 years as the Prime Minister of Barbados, one of my biggest achievements was the reform of the Social Security system. United States of America can't get theirs reformed. And day by day, there are issues about it. Because some of the things that you have to do, raise the retirement age, raise the contribution rates, change and whatever, are contentious. But what you do? Put together all the best minds in the country, develop a consensus. That was consensus was arrived at in the Allen report. And with a consensus, you can do difficult things that would otherwise divide the country. If you try to introduce things for which there is no national consensus, then it's not the quality of what you're seeking to do. It is the issue of the divisiveness that thereafter ensues that make it almost impossible to. I'm talking about how effective government is. So that For those of you who want to urge casino gambling in Barbados, go out and help, if you feel strongly about it, to build a consensus for it, because I can tell you that, in my judgment, there is going to be no issue that is more contentious and divisive at a time like this than to try to put that down on this society. So, consensus building, my friend. Yes, Lalu.
Yeah. Barbados enjoys over 52% of its exports through CARICOM. And yet, we don't have a sense of confidence perceived for the growth and achievement of full CSME. What specific things you feel can be done to stem this almost apathy towards CSME, to make it more vibrant so that it can be a platform for our global horizon?
Mr. President, I still carry the wounds inflicted upon me for having so ardently championed Caribbean integration. And may I say to you that I cannot conceive of a program of growth and development for Barbados outside the context of a strong regional economy. Barbados is a vulnerable economy. A vulnerable economy in the sense that, unlike many, even economies in the Caribbean, there's not a lot of large multinational corporation investment in most of our sectors. They're not. I think Colgate Palmolive might have been one of the last transnationals in manufacturing. We have very hardly any transnationals in tourism. And as a result, therefore, a lot of our exports, and this is true for Barbados more than most other countries in the Caribbean, most of our exports constitute surplus domestic production for the regional market. And that's what makes us vulnerable, because we don't have much opportunity to switch if the regional market goes down. It is also true that Barbados depends more on the regional market for tourism than any other Caribbean country. A large part of our distributive sector would not exist unless we had a $500 million re-export trade to the rest of the Caribbean. And even though Barbadians have complained, it is the Barbados economy and Barbados service providers that have made the most use of the provisions under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas that confers upon Caribbean citizens the rights of establishment to create enterprise in other Caribbean countries and facilitate temporary movement of natural persons. So that it is in Barbados' interest to have a growing regional economy, because the regional market is the largest market for our goods. The regional market is a larger market for our goods than Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world combined. Now, we've been drawn, I think, into an intellectual vortex. Jamaica exports 2% of its exports to the regional market. So if Jamaica was to walk away from CARICOM, the impact on the Jamaican economy would be negligible. Trinidad, 10%, Guyana, 10%. But we depend more upon a regional market than the rest of the region. And therefore, I believe that any leader of Barbados who has responsibility for the CSME must make sure, not just in the region's interest, but in our interest, that the CSME is both a successful CSME, but an expanding CSME. I was very happy when I once went to Belize. I was told that Barbadian interests had taken over the Belize citrus industry. I wanted, wherever I go into the Caribbean, to hear, not that Barbados has taken over. What a good thing. It's like how we aged in cricket. I want to hear, I was trying to work with some Barbadian investors to go down to Guyana to develop the Rupununi. And the point I'm making is this. A small, vulnerable economy, where a large number of its exporters are small, medium exporters, need the facility of the immediate regional market in order to expand. The expansion of the Barbados economy must and will continue to take place if it has to happen in our immediate neighborhood. The CSME has floundered. And for me, it is a very painful thing to observe. In 2007, we had reached a stage where we had put the arrangement for a single market in place. But that was merely to provide a platform on which you then move to a single economy. All that a market does is really, single market does remove the restrictions on the market. But a single market is not an economy. An economy is bigger than a market. And in 2007, July, at the Heads of Government Conference here, we did two things. We agreed on a roadmap for the single economy, and we also agreed that there should have been a task force on functional cooperation that addressed issues such as the provision of common services to take some of the anger that was starting to occur in the region because people were moving freely. Now, how do you develop the education system and so on consistent with the fact that labor mobility become part of the regional experience? These two things have been allowed to flounder. I'm not going to speak ill of the dead, but quite frankly, it floundered in part because having agreed to move to a single economy in 2008, a review was ordered of where we had reached, as if people didn't know. And that put the regional economy on pause. And then something happened in 2008 that I think was fatal. At its moment of greatest need, no Caribbean country could look to instruments under the CSME to solve their problems. Why? Because the countries had a major financial problem, but there were no financial instruments under the CSME, like in Europe, to solve them. I blame the region for it, because in early 2000, when Dominica had a problem, what happened? Dominica borrowed less from the IMF, had a small problem, a big problem, but a small quota in the IMF. Barbados and Trinidad lent more money to Dominica than the IMF. And Heads, under my leadership, agreed that we were going to put a regional stabilization program in place, but could not get the other countries to fund it by agreeing to earmark just a small portion of their foreign exchange reserves to be there if the regional economy needed to be stabilized. The regional economy needed to be stabilized in 2008. You had about 4 or 5 meetings of heads with task forces led by eminent economists. And believe me, there's nothing more ridiculous than men and women who are supposed to be powerful meeting and then nothing happened. That's true. So when heads of government meet on a most important matter that needs urgent attention, something must happen. But nothing happened because, in my view, the heads got bad advice. The advice that was given to heads, I think, was G20 countries agreed that large sums of money should have been earmarked for support for developing countries to come out of the global financial crisis. The IDB was identified to be the institution through which the region got help. And a program was developed through the IDB. And we have eminent people who serve our interests on the IDB. That they came up with a program that earmarked $500,000 for Barbados for something called a liquidity fund for growth sustainability. And what that fund presumed was that the rest of the world had a liquidity problem. So we had a liquidity problem too. And therefore they provided money in a liquidity problem to solve a liquidity fund to solve a liquidity problem that we did not have. So that in 2008, the regional approach to deal with the problem failed because of the nonsense of asking the IDB, to put on the regional behalf a solution to the problem that addressed a problem that the region did not have. Consider what would have happened if that money would have been put in a fund for public sector capital development that would have allowed Barbados and the region to have access to quick disbursement financing that would have enabled us to replace the private capital inflows that really was bedeviling the region. So that 2008, when the region needed a regional solution, the region was failed. And since then, we in the Caribbean like to play what they call an indigenous stroke. We doubt ourselves. And people doubt once the doubt is triggered, it will multiply. So the doubt, ever so welcome wait for a call went forth as the message on the CSME. That was a bad mistake. But things that can and should be done to carry forward the CSME are simple things that should be done. What is to be done? I spoke today about business facilitation. The roadmap that was laid out in 2007 government plan addresses matters such as how do you harmonize the reporting and all the procedures across the Caribbean that stand in the way of businesses meeting the same set of conditions in one place. That's why you create a single economy. You have the same reporting all across the region. Consider how many hundreds of millions of dollars would be saved to the private sector in Barbados and elsewhere if you didn't have to fill out different forms and have different reporting requirements to do business in the Caribbean. The government plan called for the region to have a financial services agreement. Why? Because financial conglomerates like CLECO were treating the region as a single economy in advance of rules in respect of how that regional economy should function. So does it seem natural to you that we should therefore have a regional financial services agreement? We were also negotiating with Europe and now with Canada on matters that required us to have new rules of investment with those countries. How do you put in your trade agreement rules on investment with Europe and the States and Canada, but you don't have a regional investment code that describe and prescribe how investment within the Caribbean will be equally protected? So the single market and single economy is not a threat to business. It is something that is supposed, the single economy part of it, standardization, harmonization of all these things is really intended to make the economy function as a virtual economy and make it easy to do business in the region. So to stop it has been a serious mistake. But the thing that has been stopped the most that I believe that has to be addressed eventually is to have regional production in areas where it is possible. Now, in 2007, there was a spike in global commodity prices. Global recession has taken that aspect of pricing out of this situation. But you can be sure that once the global economy resumes its buoyancy, food prices will go up again. It will. Demand for food by China and India will eventually drive up food prices again. And the region must at some stage agree that now that the single market allows capital to move, labor to move, and it should move, and that people have rights of establishment, pan-Caribbean companies must be formed. Join capital, labor, technology, expertise all across the Caribbean, and go to the empty places in the Caribbean to produce the food, to enable us to conceive of a future where we do not become victims of a spike in food prices in the future. So that Barbadian companies, believe me, Barbadian companies, and I bet no together on a number of cases with Caribbean entrepreneurs since I was no longer the Prime Minister to try to put this in place. That the single market for you must mean that you can have to create a pan-Caribbean company. Barbados will never be able to deal with food security on its own. But Barbadian people should be involved in helping to invest in food production wherever it can be done in the Caribbean to give us a future where food prices don't kill our people again. And this is what this single economy is supposed to be about. But it requires, again, leadership. And when it was the Prime Minister, there is no law in the Caribbean that says Owen S has the power to do X and Y in the Caribbean. But in the Caribbean, we make things happen by the power of our voice. And the CSMB needs an advocate. And that you can make things happen by influencing things and causing people to see this is the direction in which we have to go. And believe me, the Caribbean needs a single economy more desperately than ever. I'm envious when I hear about Europe trying to stabilize Greece and others, when we in the Caribbean could have had a regional stabilization policy program. And that what was required? We take our foreign exchange now, Have we invested in treasury bills of the United States government to help America to deal with its issues? A regional stabilization program that says rather than put all our foreign exchange reserves in U.S. treasuries, let us invest some of them in a regional stabilization plan so that if our countries run into problems, they can look to a regional mechanism for a regional solution. And I say to you that the region has come under pressure because at its moment of greatest need, Caribbean governments struggling with cash flow could not look to the regional single market economy for a solution. The mechanism had become the fifth wheel to the coach. And therefore, I said we can revisit it. How you revisit it, sir? It has to be made now to matter in the lives of ordinary people. You have no to sell it by its results. And that to get it going again, Caribbean governments and their leaders will have to look at what aspects of the CSME you can now immediately execute and implement to add value to what individual governments are doing to be able to address the crises that they face. If you don't bring that immediate value added, then you can have this distance being perpetuated by respect. Because what will happen if the regional movement cannot help to solve their problem, individual countries will do what they're doing now. Look to Venezuela, look to China, look to Taiwan, and look elsewhere to provide that which they can. I hope I've answered your question. But believe me, Barbados needs this SME. But it doesn't only need it. Barbados must give leadership to it, and give leadership to it in an unapologetic way. Because for a country that depends on 52% of its exports on a market, you have a vested interest in making sure that that market is viable. One last question. Yes, Tony. Yes, Mr. Hoyes. Trouble. How are you?
Mr. Arthur, thank you for your stimulating speech. I noticed from the confidence in which it was delivered that it portends that you probably feel you'll be in an actual executive position to implement some of it in the near future.
No, Tony, if I read it a certain way, because I have to pick up my daughter sometime soon.
Mr. Arthur, I wanted to follow up on my friend Eddie's comments, because I think there were a lot of what he was saying was overshadowed by one part of it and not the original part. So I hope I don't paraphrase him wrong. But I think what Eddie was trying to get at is the feeling perhaps in the business community that investment in the future in Barbados requires going with names that the visitors or the business community already know. These are what he says international brands. And the day of trying now to compete with the local brands that are already established, I don't only mean in fast food, I mean in other areas, the length of investment would be too long, and therefore people would not want to put their money, that kind of money, into something. The game has changed, and the market needs now, if you're going to put money into used brands. And that brings up the question of the terrible Franchise Act, which we have in Barbados, which governs these things, and which unfortunately makes even fair and wise decisions seem to have the taint of political corruption in them, because at the end of the day, first of all, the request for the franchise, even if it's a hotel, technically has to go to the public for comment, which means that the entrenched can complain about it. And then at the end of the day, the Minister of Finance, him or herself, has to say yes or no. Have you given any thought to making that particular process more transparent and faster, bearing in mind the charges made by a former charge d'affaires here, much more eloquent than I, at a Chamber of Commerce meeting a year or two ago, as to the horrors that have been experienced with franchises or attempting to get franchises? Could you speak to that a bit?
The issue of franchises and the grant of creates a more liberal approach to it had to do with the way in which we sought to implement our trade policy, especially in relation to services. I don't know if you're familiar with how you negotiate under the WTO, but there's a process of offers and proposals. And countries in negotiating new trade agreements bilaterally, but also under the multilateral thing, you put proposals. I want to offer to liberalize this sector, but you give me something in return. So in our instance, as you might know, in 1994, when Barbados joined the WTO, we put only a few offers on the table in the expectation they had to get something in return for them. Now, the liberalization of the fast food sector, therefore, is one that is caught by that strategic approach to negotiating trade agreements. There's no saying that we will never do it, but you put it forward as an area to liberalize on the understanding that people who will benefit from your opening your market to them put something on the table that give you equivalent value. And it was caught in that because, quite frankly, I'm not sure that apart from the EPA, and the EPA with Europe, I think it's a major move forward, that we were getting under the multilateral approach to trade liberalization, getting proposals from other people to give us access to their markets for services that would warrant us giving up to them something that was of such great value, especially to small producers in Barbados. So the answer to the question is this, that there is no hard and fast rule, certainly in the Barbados Labour Party, that we should just hold on to this as an article of religious faith. It is something that we have to deal with as a trade negotiation exercise. And I feel that, quite frankly, that we live in a liberalized world. We will increasingly do so. And that to get from other people, we're going to have to put to other people. We have already started that process. Our trade, our services negotiation with Europe is one of which we liberalize. Europe liberalized faster with us in services than with any other entity in the world. I mean, it's an accomplishment that it exists on paper, but it's not being acted upon. And the more you go into trade liberalization, the more you're going to have to open up. So our position was, this is something that we're going to have to do under multilateral rules. If you do it upfront, bilaterally, then when we come to the multilateral stage, you get nothing in return. And the answer to you is this, that I envision that a day is going to come when all that is going to go. But let us manage it so as we give up, we get in return. But Tony, I hope you heard clearly the strategic answer given to Mr. Aben, that there are things in Barbados that needs to be done, but sometimes can only properly be done if you build a strong consensus for them. And I would want you to help me to act upon it if necessary, if you think that dealing with liberalizing fast foods is something that there should be a consensus about. But good seeing you.
Yeah, thank you.